Friends, welcome. We are really grateful that you're here, and I'm particularly grateful to have Carole Bucy teach this morning. Given that we're talking about suffrage, I thought I would wear my vote mask to start with. We can take it off now. I had the chance yesterday to go down to the Tennessee State Museum to see the exhibit that Carole and others worked on suffrage, and it was wonderful. I encourage you to go. It was very safe to do that for Amy, Leah, and I. Had a great experience. Carole's going to focus on the religious aspect of the suffrage movement today, and I think we're going to have a chance to see how both the pros and the antis used religion to try to get their cause moved forward. Carole, thank you so very much for coming and be part of this. I can't wait to hear the bells ring on Tuesday, and for you keeping this alive for us.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Good morning. Let's go back to Nashville, the third Sunday in August, 1920. If you were a part of this congregation, you were part of Moore Memorial Presbyterian Church, just across from downtown Nashville on the other side of the Gulch. Your pastor had resigned in May to take a job at a church in Durham, North Carolina, and every Sunday your pulpit was filled by someone else. Now, that third Sunday in 1920, chaos reigned in downtown Nashville. There were people all over the streets. People were calling what was going on in Nashville Armageddon, the War of the Roses. There was a fierce political contest going on, and it was about whether or not women should have the right to vote. It's amazing to think that anybody much would oppose women voting, but indeed there were many who did. Now, the reason there was so much excitement in downtown Nashville was because our governor had called a special session for the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which would give 27 million American women the right to vote. It was chaos on the streets of Nashville. The traffic, let me tell you what. You think the NFL Draft or the Country Music Hall of Fame Music Festival is traffic city down there? It was worse in 1920. Well, yes, you're saying, but not that many people had cars. But it was a combination of cars and wagons and horses and any other conveyance that people could get. The streets were a mess. Reporters had come in from all over the United States to see the show, and indeed a show it was, with the center of the action at the Hermitage Hotel. Now, on Friday before that third Sunday in August, the Tennessee Senate had ratified the amendment. They had voted to approve it. It was now down to one house in one state, the Tennessee State House of Representatives. The amendment had passed through the U.S. Congress in 1919, and it had gone out to the states for ratification. The suffrage leaders had written off the South from the very beginning. They didn't think there was a chance the amendment would get passed here in any of the states of the former Confederacy. And in the spring of 1920, we got up to 33, 34, and in March, Washington State ratified the amendment, bringing us up to 35, and then there was a stall. And it came down to two states, North Carolina and Tennessee. Both governors had called the special sessions into being, and both governors were dearly hoping that the other state would beat them to the draw and ratify the amendment so that their state would not have to do it. So here we've got our pastor at Moore Memorial who has resigned. We don't know what the future holds for our church. And I must admit, as a historian, I've always looked for people in the congregational records of Moore Memorial who might have some historical significance to Nashville or Tennessee history. And indeed, all my work on suffrage, I'm always terrified that I'm going to find some of the more memorial women who were actually anti-suffragists. But indeed, last night in the 10 o'clock-ish hour, I came across an article in the newspaper about a very interesting meeting that was meeting in Nashville, the Southern Christian Citizenship Conference. It had met in March of that year, and our pastor, David Scanlon, was one of the organizers of this. And this was the first of this citizenship conference held in the South. There had been several of these Christian citizenship conferences held around the country, but none had been held in the states of the former Confederacy. And so this group of organizers really wanted women to play a major part in these meetings. And indeed, the more memorial women did play a major part in these meetings. The person who moderated the sessions that were exclusively for women was none other than our own suffragist Ann Dallas Dudley. Now, she was a member of Christ Episcopal Church, but she was the moderator for all the sessions. And all the other suffragists, the leaders of the Tennessee group, whether they were Jewish or Catholic, were participating in some of these sessions. Indeed, they had actually brought a well-known suffragist from Arkansas to Nashville to speak at the Hermitage Hotel to a luncheon of women about woman suffrage. So I was relieved to know that at least More Memorial's pastors were not preaching against women's rights when I found that last night. No one could escape the news that was going on in Nashville. So let's go back a bit and tell the backstory. The anti-suffrage, let me rephrase that. The suffrage movement first came out of an idea for women's rights that began really in 1848 in earnest in a Methodist church in Seneca Falls, New York. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott were active in the anti-slavery movement, and they had gone to London to an anti-slavery meeting and were highly distressed to find out that they were not going to be able to participate in the meetings and were going to have to sit in the gallery or outside. So they agreed that they needed to do something about women's rights. They called this meeting for Seneca Falls in the Methodist Church, and people in the anti-slavery movement from around the state of New York and some of the neighboring states come to talk about women's rights. Now, woman suffrage was only one of the 12 or 14 rights that they brought forth that day, but Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a young mother, was a fine writer, and she also had a little bit of a sense of humor, because the Declaration of Rights she patterned on none other than the Declaration of Independence. So at the get-go, the men were beginning to squirm a little bit. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. And it goes on from there with the he has, instead of being the king, it was all of the men in the United States as the he has. Of all of that list of recommendations and resolutions, the one that caused the most controversy was giving women the right to vote. He has denied her the right to the elective franchise. Indeed, many of the delegates voted for all of the resolutions except that one. Frederick Douglass, a former slave, was at the meeting. He voted for woman suffrage. And so that's where the movement began, out of the anti-slavery movement. Well, now you know how this story is going to go along. The churches begin to split in the late 1840s and 1850s, and as David Will said, when the churches began to split, there was really no hope for the country. Northern Presbyterians, Southern Presbyterians, Northern Baptists, Southern Baptists, Northern Methodists, Southern Methodists, the denominations came apart because of the issue of slavery. And so the Civil War really stopped all women's activities except for war work until the war was ended and slavery had been defeated, and the South had returned to the Union, but initially in a sort of transitory state. And they did not like those years, Southerners did not like those years of Reconstruction, because they felt the federal government was in their states telling them what to do. And the federal government was in the southern states, but it was to protect the rights of African Americans, the freedmen. So, a part of that period that we call Reconstruction in our history books really focuses on 3 amendments to the United States Constitution. The First Amendment freed the slaves. Tennessee, we had no problem with that because we had already taken care of that before that amendment was sent out to the states. Tennessee freed its slaves by a constitutional amendment in early 1865, before the war actually ended. So Tennessee was going to be back in the Union pretty quickly. The 14th Amendment is the first time in our Constitution that we see the subject of gender come up. And this amendment gave African American men their rights as citizens. The 15th Amendment gave African American men the right to vote. So African men are getting equality under the law with the 14th Amendment and the right to vote with the 15th Amendment, and women were excluded. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton has now been joined by Susan B. Anthony, another worker in the anti-slavery movement, and they are outraged. They feel that their friend Frederick Douglass has stabbed them in the back by not demanding equal rights for women. But he said, this is the hour of the African American man. And so indeed, these women go to work single-mindedly on the cause of getting the right to vote. There were lots of disagreements. Some felt it should be state by state with state constitutions. Others felt that it should be an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And so that's how it came. And we get down here to the South. Now, after the South, when the Union troops were officially removed from all southern states in 1877, Jim Crow ruled. Jim Crow was a form of racial subjugation in which African Americans were denied their rights by the states themselves. And so what we see here are 3 big pieces of opposition by Southerners to women having the right to vote, and lots of other rights as well. The first was that giving women the right to vote would give African American men, again, the right to vote. Now, yes, the 15th Amendment had given African American men the right to vote, but southern states had figured out all sorts of ingenious ways to keep that from happening. Literacy tests, grandfather clause, there's all sorts of history tests. Can you recite the Constitution? The Declaration of Independence, perhaps. African Americans had slowly seen their rights evaporate in many of the southern states. Now, another big piece of this opposition was the preachers. I'm sure that no one preaching at Moore Memorial would have dared criticize women's rights, but amazingly, lots and lots of preachers read their Bible in different ways. The biblical mandate of subservience was loud and clear in church services dealing with almost any subject you could imagine, women and African American. And for women, it was all Eve's fault. Of course, we could say that it was Adam's fault. He didn't really have to take that apple, did he? So anyway, then you've got, in addition to the race issue, the biblical issue, you've also got plain old politics. Amazingly, there were a lot of special interest groups in Tennessee in 1920, and they all had a piece in trying to keep women from having the right to vote because they thought it was just going to open the door to trouble. Women would demand better kinds of legislation to protect children and women. You could already blame women for prohibition. That Women's Christian Temperance Union had rammed through the Tennessee House and Senate in 1909, 10 years before national prohibition. Let's blame the women for that. What else could these women be capable of doing? What would they be doing? And so you see, the liquor interests were alive and well here, and they did not want women voting. Then you have the manufacturers. These were people who owned cotton mills all over the South. Rural Tennessee was covered with little cotton mills where the employees were women and children. If women had the right to vote, goodness gracious, they might want heat in those factories in the wintertime. They might want safety regulations. What would it come to if women started proposing legislation to regulate industry in this country, in this state? And then finally, there were the railroads. The railroads in Tennessee had a tremendous amount of power, and they did not want to share it with the women. Now, let's put all of this into the context of the Gilded Age and what's going on nationally and even internationally. In this larger world of Christianity, towards the end of the 19th century, the late 1800s, you begin seeing over in England, and then some scholars here in the United States as well, thinking that the King James Version of the Bible, the official version, needs to be updated. The language needs to be improved. We've got better ways in 1870 and 80 to do Hebrew and Greek grammar. We can make more sophisticated translations of some of the ancient manuscripts. And so a team of 50 or so scholars from Great Britain and the United States embarked on this project to revise the King James Version of the Bible. And the result of this was the English Revised Version of the Bible. The New Testament came out in 1881, the Old Testament in 1885. Well, as you know, Americans have kind of had this thing with the British. And so the American professors and scholars that worked on this were not totally satisfied as to what was going on. And so they decided that they would also do their version of the Bible. And so indeed, in 1901, the American Revised Standard Version came out. And so we now have 3 versions of the Bible that are out there. So I want to put that into the story here because this is part of the discussion of the opposition. The United States was in a time of national crisis. Evangelical Protestantism was in a time of national crisis. We had Moody out there holding revivals and organizing groups, and he's going to be followed in the 20th century by Billy Sunday. We're having lots of revivals, one of which took place here in Tennessee, in Nashville, when Reverend Sam Jones held his big tent revivals downtown. So here we are going into the 20th century. Now let me say a bit about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, because she is going to be dead by 1920, but she was living on that summer in August here in Nashville. And the reason was that the antis were using some of her writings as biblical blasphemy. Now let me say a bit about Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was raised in a Presbyterian household. Her father was a lawyer. She had a bunch of brothers, but yet people saw in Elizabeth a spark of interest and curiosity, a lively mind that you didn't see in her brothers and lots of other boys of that time. She was allowed to go to the Johnstown Academy with her brothers, and a Scottish pastor did a lot of the teaching there of Greek, and he allowed Elizabeth to take some of these classes with the boys. Well, guess what? She won the prize, but they wouldn't give it to her because she was a girl. They had to give her second place because the prize winner had to be a male. And so at her own church, the girls were raising money by saving their pennies to send a boy to school, to provide an education for a boy at the Auburn Theological Seminary. And they helped buy him a new black suit when he graduated. And they were doing things to educate boys and at the expense of educating themselves. So in between these two translations of the Bible comes Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who does know the Bible. She has read it backwards and forwards. And what troubles her is not so much the Bible, but it's the way the preachers seem to interpret it. And of course, the way a preacher interprets it is infallible, right? So I've got an audience here today of two pastors. That's why I'm able to say that. So she organized a committee, and they started looking at the Bible. She was not trying to paraphrase it. She was not trying to translate it. She was not rewriting the King James Version of the Bible. But what she was doing was writing a commentary. And she had a large committee of women who were helping with different parts of this. So the commentary was her interpretation of parts of the Bible that dealt with women. And of course, we know that there are some parts of the Old Testament, especially, that don't really have many women showing up at all. And so she took the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and then she took the New Testament, and she combined the New Testament with the rest of the Old Testament from Joshua to Malachi and put that together. But most of her ink was spent on the Apostle Paul. And this Bible it was called the Woman's Bible, which was very unfortunate because it was a interpretation of the Bible for women to use and find applicable to their spiritual needs and for their benefit. So now here is Moore Memorial Presbyterian Church. It's still a part of the southern branch of the Presbyterian Church of the United States. And among our denomination's most outspoken anti-feminist, if you will, was Robert Louis Dabney. He was a professor at the Union Seminary in Virginia. He had been a chaplain during the Civil War. He was outspoken in that he supported slavery and he was against women's rights. Ultimately, I think Union probably exiled him. He ended up out in Texas, in Victoria, Texas. But he wrote many, many things about how women should not have equality under any circumstances. He was anti-African American. He was anti-women. Now, he and other Christians used the Bible as their justification why women should not have equality. And these anti-suffrage folks who use the Bible as being anti-suffrage focus on about 4 passages of the Bible, and if you'll email me after this is over, I'll send you the passages. They're up there on the slide for you. But Genesis chapter 2 and 3 contradicts Genesis chapter 1, where God in chapter 1 made male and female, created he them. And Genesis chapter 2 and 3, of course, deal with the fall of humanity. Then we come to Paul. And Corinthians, of course, is a favorite passage, saying women should be silent. It was often used to justify why women should not even have speaking parts in church. Of course, one woman here in Tennessee challenged none other than David Lipscomb about this and said, well, if women have to be silent in the church, then I guess that means we shouldn't even be singing or praying. And so, of course, he did want women to continue women's work in the church. Now, 1 Timothy again, let women learn in silence with all subjection, but I suffer not woman to teach nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. Again, and then in Ephesians, women, be subject to your husband. And so Stanton's point was pretty easy. You can look at the Women's Bible, and it's really quite interesting to see the passages that she spends the most time on in it. But her point was, let's face it, Genesis contradicts Genesis. Paul contradicts Paul. What about Galatians 3:28? There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Now, the suffragists by 1910, 1920 were already focused singularly on getting the right to vote. And of course, here in town, one of the leading Christian spokespeople is David Lipscomb, who has a school named for him here in our city. He was the editor of the Gospel Advocate, the church's weekly newspaper, and it had a vast readership in the South and in Kentucky and Missouri and some of the other states, but it had a vast readership here, and his voice was indeed regarded as the final interpretation of anything. So here we have a woman down in Fayetteville, Tennessee, right on the Alabama border, just above Huntsville, Selena Holman, who decides to take Lipscomb's interpretations on. She begins in the 1870s by writing letters to the editor of the Gospel Advocate about how the church treats women, and he could have ignored those, but no, he was going to use that as a teaching opportunity. He responded directly to Mrs. Holman's letters, and this debate about the role and equality of women went on between Lipscomb and Selena Holman in the pages of the Gospel Advocate for 20 years. Neither of them budged an inch. At the end of their lives, Selena Holman died first. She died of an appendectomy in 1915. Knowing that she was dying, she told her friends that she did not want David Lipscomb to come to Fayetteville and conduct her funeral. She too was a very smart woman. And so women had a dose of subservience that they got in many churches on Sunday. Now, let's go back to ratification and what's going on in Nashville. The Senate has ratified it. The states have gotten it down to 35. It is interesting to think about something that Nashville does that really is quite remarkable. They hosted this Christian citizenship conference, as I mentioned, in March, not knowing that we were going to have this big fight on ratification in August here in town. And so it was an interesting time in Nashville because no one in Tennessee, I don't think even the suffragists themselves thought that Tennessee would ever get the chance to ratify it. But when we got down to 35 states, they pressured Governor Albert Roberts, to call the special session. He was a Democrat. He was running in a very contested Democratic primary, and he was nervous about winning his primary election before the general election in November. But he called the special session to convene the week after the Democratic primary was over, and yes, indeed, he did win. So August the 9th is the day that he has called. And here we see coming to town a national leader and a state leader. Coming in to lead the national women who want suffrage and the Tennessee suffragists is Carrie Chapman Catt. She comes in mid-July, gets off the train at the Union Station and checks into the Hermitage Hotel. Josephine Pearson from Mont Eagle, Tennessee, is the leader of the opposition, the Tennessee Women Opposed to Suffrage. She comes into town that very same day, checks into the Hermitage Hotel. Sue Shelton White, a suffragist, but one of the more radical suffragists, that group of young women who were chiding our Presbyterian president, Woodrow Wilson, for not supporting the amendment, and so much so that he finally did after they chained themselves to the White House fence and burned him in effigy. He finally did say he supported women's suffrage. She comes into town, but she can't afford the Hermitage Hotel. She checks into the Tulane Hotel. And so what we have is the scene set right here in Nashville for this special session. It was a cartoonist heyday. You see cartoons with women who are going to get the right to vote, and we are going to clean up politics. We're going to wash those dirty politicians down and make it clean. And then you see the antis with the rooster there looking at those eggs. He doesn't know what he's supposed to do with those eggs while his wife is going out, the hen is going out of the house to vote. So you see also these two women, one dressed very seductively with the word suffrage, and another one in the same form of fashion who is for anti-suffrage. And there's our poor old legislator who, right in the middle, he doesn't know which way to turn. So that was what was going on. You see a man there at home with a screaming child as the wife is going out to vote. So Miss Pearson is checked in at the Hermitage. Miss Cat is checked in at the Hermitage, and the troops begin to rally for each side before the legislator's arrival for the special session on the 9th. Now, of all the things that the antis did, the most provocative was the fact that they opened in the Hermitage Hotel a museum exhibit. And this was showing you visually exactly why women should not be given the right to vote. After all, these were highly racially charged images. They had pictures of Susan B. Anthony with Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington. They had all manner of information from eugenicists who were very much touting genetic inferiority of races and sexes. And these folks were thinking that they were actually having to save the South. It wasn't just Tennessee, it was the South. Now, you know what that means. That is the 11 states of the former Confederacy. They were wrapped up in the lost cause. The United Daughters of the Confederacy had organized shortly after the war. They became a national organization right here in Nashville in 1890s. And they were determined to try to work as hard as they could to keep things as it was back before the Civil War. Yes, they lost the Civil War, and they knew that quite well. But when the ex-Confederates returned to power in Tennessee and the other southern states, the South had been redeemed. Love that religious language there. We were redeeming the South, they thought. Yes, enslaved Africans were now free, but in many places their lives had not changed a bit. You see, their lives are pretty much what they were before. They worked as sharecroppers instead of slaves. They had the right to marry. They had the right to organize their own churches. But generally speaking, in the rural parts of Tennessee, African Americans could not vote. Now, here in Nashville, we had a substantial class of African Americans who had businesses, very prosperous. James Napier, leading African American lawyer here, became the U.S. Treasurer under William Howard Taft and served in that position, the highest ranking African American in the United States political system at that time. But people were longing for the days of the Old South. They were looking at the world, the industrialized world of the early 20th century with rose-colored glasses. When the Confederate veterans had their reunion in Nashville in 1897, they came together and, of course, had our Governor Robert Taylor to give a welcoming speech. And let me read you just a bit of what he said to the veterans that day. I doubt if the world will ever see another civilization as brilliant as that which perished in the South a third of a century ago. Its white-columned mansions under cool spreading groves, and its cotton fields stretching away to the horizon along with toiling slaves. Its pomp and pride and revelry, its splendid manhood and dazzling beauty of its women place it as the high tide of earthly glory. Look yonder at those flashing domes and glittering spires. Look at what Southern brains and Southern hands have wrought. See the victories of peace we have won. Why was Southern manhood so threatened by women having the right to vote? That was something they were always talking about. It's going to be a threat to manhood. Men will be less manly if women are allowed to vote. And to connect all of this to Carrie Chapman Catt, what's going on, she is here at this historic moment, trying to keep her suffragists focused on things going on. But one of the things that she starts being criticized is a part of that museum exhibit. For you see, they had not only pictures of Susan B. Anthony with African Americans, they had not only copies of bills that had been introduced in Congress but never passed to force Southern states to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments for African American men. They had copies of those force bills, as they were called, but the thing that got the most attention was a copy of Mrs. Stanton's Bible. And it turned out that Carrie Chapman Catt, they had been digging hard to get some dirt on her. They found out that she was on the committee that had done the editing and some of the writing of the commentary that was known as the Woman's Bible. And this became statewide news. Mrs. Catt is tied to that Bible. Is that what you want your women reading? Perhaps it should have been banned in the South like Uncle Tom's Cabin had been before the Civil War. So the antis charge Mrs. Catt, and this is a perfect distraction tactic. Let's get Mrs. Catt over here trying to defend her work on the Bible and her blasphemy here, and let's get this away from the focus on the matter at hand, which is convincing these Tennessee lawmakers that they need to oppose suffrage. We need to get a few more to change sides, or we're going to lose this battle. So it was a great distraction tactic. The attacks on Catt were relentless. They ran all sorts of ads. This is what the teaching of the National American Suffrage Association is like. Are you willing to hold these women, for women to have these views and become political powers in our country? And then there was communism. The Russian Revolution had taken place, and we were in a red scare in this country. Labor unions, any group of organization could be painted with the brush of communism, Bolshevism, radicalism, socialism. For those of you who are like me, able to remember the 1950s, you will remember that when Martin Luther King Jr. began to rise up in the national media as an eloquent spokesman on behalf of African American rights, he was accused of being a communist. So that was being fanned in Carrie Chapman Catt's face. And she's trying to keep her women here focused on getting this amendment passed and preventing more lawmakers from changing sides. Now, the reason I'm wearing this yellow rose is because, as I said from the beginning, this one name for this was the War of the Roses. The women who supported suffrage wore yellow flowers. It was the color of suffrage. The antis wore red flowers of some kind, representing Southern purity. They were saving the South from the vote. And indeed, you could tell what side somebody was on by the color of the flowers they were wearing on their lapel those 2 weeks of that part of the special session. It was so bad, the criticism of Mrs. Catt, that the day that the House was supposed to vote, on August the 17th, the editors of the Tennessean said, things are desperate, we've got to try to help. They wrote an editorial and they said, you know, if the Women's Bible is unorthodox, then Jefferson's homemade Bible certainly is unorthodox. If we are to drag this question of religion into politics, let us be consistent about it. But what bearing has the Woman's Bible or Jefferson's Bible on the matter at issue today in the Tennessee House of Representatives? Let logic, not prejudice, rule. So, the 17th, all eyes are on the House, and guess what? It is a long drawn-out debate, intentionally drawn out to prevent the vote. They adjourn to reconvene on the next day, August the 18th, at 10:30 a.m. And that is where the drama really picks up. As the antis get up that morning, they are confident. They think they've got 49 votes, and that will defeat it by a vote of 49 to 47. Yes, the Speaker of the Tennessee House had indeed changed sides at the beginning of the session. He had been very much in favor of women having the right to vote, and he had jumped on the side of the antis. We never knew exactly why. He claimed it was a constitutional issue. He was a very fine lawyer. He was young, he was under 30 years old, and he had a long and very successful career as a very fine lawyer here in Nashville. But the antis saw that they had 49 votes, and they were pretty sure this was going to be it. North Carolina had decided to table the amendment the day before. They got word that morning that North Carolina was out of the race, so it was down to Tennessee, and the Tennessee suffragists were nervous. They knew they didn't have the vote. So the session begins, and Speaker Walker immediately hands the gavel to preside over to the Speaker pro tem, so that as a member of the General Assembly, he can come down on the floor of the House and speak against the amendment, which he does. And then he says, I move we put this amendment where it belongs, on the table. In other words, let's vote not to vote. Now the vote is going to begin. Will we not even have a vote on it? So down the roll call it goes. And Banks Turner, another young state rep from Trenton, Tennessee, Gibson County in West Tennessee, he doesn't really vote, and then he votes very quietly, and he says, I want to change my vote. And he votes not to table the amendment. So the vote on the amendment being tabled is now 48 to 48, which according to the rules, a tie is not a victory. That means the House will indeed vote on the amendment next. And so the House does begin the vote. And the Speaker gets to the name of Harry T. Byrne, a young state rep from Nyota, Tennessee, over in East Tennessee in McMinn County. He has been regarded as a safe anti-suffrage vote, and Harry Byrne votes aye. Well, there's a moment of shock. And then everybody sees what's happened. The antis are furious, the suffragists are cautiously optimistic, but a tie is not going to be a victory in this case. And then coming on down the line, Banks Turner also votes yes, and the amendment passes by a vote of 50 to 48. Now, there were some hugs, there was some crying. The antis were furious. But what there wasn't was a huge party of celebration, because the suffragists knew that the antis were not going to concede defeat. They knew they were going to try every shenanigan in the books. And for the next month, they kept trying to get the vote overturned. They had a big rally at the Ryman Auditorium on the night of the 19th. All of the antis were speaking about the unconstitutionality of it, its religious ramifications, and everything else. But they were determined to get a court order, an injunction to prevent our governor from signing the necessary documents to send it on to Washington to the Secretary of State of the United States. So they tried that, but they were not able to get an injunction. They tried to get more votes, but they were never able to get the votes. And so on August the 24th, Governor Roberts signed the documents, sent them special delivery mail to Washington, where Bainbridge Cole, would be the U.S. Secretary of State, signed them early that morning as soon as they arrived. And the 19th Amendment was now added to the Constitution. There was no bell ringing, because the fight was still quietly going on here, and the suffragists were afraid to celebrate for fear that the antis might actually succeed. They actually sent a delegation to Washington the week after Secretary of State Colby signed it, and they were unable to get him to do anything to overturn the ratification of the amendment. And so, that's the end of our story. There was no bell ringing, but you can be assured that tomorrow, Tuesday, I have my bell and I will be ringing my bell. I hope you will too. August 2020. Here the suffragists saw in 1920 something wonderful happening, them beginning to the long road to equality. And here it is time for us as Americans, not just women, but as Americans, to take up the mantle of our mothers and fathers. Let us renew ourselves to this cause for which these folks gave their full measure of devotion, the cause for which our country was founded, for liberty and justice for all. Put on the mantle of liberty and justice. Let us walk in the footsteps of these who have trod this path before us. Thank you very much.